The wind blew across the broken land where ash floated in the air like grey snow, and the sun hung low behind clouds of smoke, and Jace walked slowly with his boots sinking into soft dirt, and his heart heavy in his chest, as he saw the remains of what was once a village filled with life and song, and light now silent and still, and burned beyond recognition. He moved carefully, stepping over shattered wood and strange bones, and metal parts that looked like armor or tools, and his hand stayed close to the grip of his sidearm, though he knew it would not help much if danger appeared again, for the things that did this were not beasts or men, but something worse, and older, and angry. Then he saw Hershey sat beside a large body lying near the center of the village, a tall alien man covered in old armor with deep cracks and blood around the edges, and a long sword resting across his chest like a final gift for the afterlife. And the girl had silver skin and long dark hair braided down her back, and her eyes burned with quiet fire as she looked at Jace without fear or hate. He stopped, but did not raise his hands, because something in her eyes told him she did not see him as the enemy, not yet, and she said nothing for a long moment. Just stared and breathed and kept one hand on the blade, as if the dead man might wake and rise again to speak or move or protect her one. Last time Jace spoke first, his voice low and tired, and rough from smoke and dust, and days without sleep, and he said, "I am not here to fight, and I do not want trouble, and I came because I saw the smoke and heard the sounds and thought maybe someone needed help, and maybe I was not too late." This time the girl still said nothing, but her grip on the sword loosened just a little, and her head tilted to one side like she was listening to more than his words, maybe to the tone or the weight of them, or the truth that sat behind his tired eyes. Then she spoke, and her voice was clear and full of something deep and old and sad and strong, and she said, "He was my father, and he died here defending this place from the ones who came in the dark with metal wings and burning breath, and they broke his armor, but not his will. And when the final blow came, he held this sword, and he stood over me so they could not take me to Jace. Did not know what to say, so he said nothing, and only nodded, and looked down at the sword, which seemed to shimmer in the fading light, like it was still alive, or dreaming, or waiting for something to happen. And the girl saw his eyes on it, and said, "This blade is not just a weapon. It is memory, and honor, and blood, and oath, and pain, and hope, and I have no strength left to lift it." Again he looked at her, and said, "I am sorry for your loss, and I wish I could have come sooner, but I was lost and running and hiding, and only now did I find this place. And now I stand before you not as a soldier, but as a man who wants to help, if he can, and if you will let Mesh." Stood slowly, her knees shaking a little, and the blade still in her hand, and she stepped forward. Not fast, not slow, just steady and with purpose, and she stopped in front of him, and held the sword flat in both hands, like an offering or a test, and she said, "This sword is not mine anymore, and maybe it never was, and it was his, and now it waits for someone who can carry the fire again, and if your heart is true, maybe it will not burn you when you touch it." Use reached out with care, with doubt, with respect, and wrapped his fingers around the hilt, and the metal felt warm, not hot, not cold, just alive. And the moment he lifted it, the air around them seemed to shift, like the earth itself paused to listen, and the wind stopped, and even the distant sound of machines fell quiet. The girl watched, and her lips parted, and she said in a softer voice than before, "It did not reject you, and maybe that means something. Maybe it means more than we both know, and maybe you were not lost. Maybe you were meant to be here now, in this moment, with me and with him, and with the sword that once saved my life." Jace nodded, and held the blade with both hands, and something inside him stirred like a memory not his own, and a voice whispered in his ear, not in words but in feelings and images, and he knew without knowing how, that this was the beginning, not the end, and the path ahead would be hard and long, and full of danger, but also of meaning. And the girl looked at him and said, "What is your name?" And he said, "Jace," and she said, "Mine is Viren." And she touched the sword gently, and said, "Then let us walk this road together, warrior, stranger, bearer of my father's blade." The sky turned darker as clouds rolled in heavy and wide, and the wind picked up with a chill that touched skin and bone, and Viren stood beside Jace with the sword still glowing faintly in his grip, and her eyes narrowed, not in anger, but in thought, like she was reading something deeper than what he showed on the outsides. Said, "That sword is old beyond counting, and it carries not just the weight of metal, but the weight of lives and pain and dreams, and the blade does not like liars or cowards or those who fight for nothing." And she looked at him long and deep, and said, "You must not hold it, unless you mean to protect, not to strike." Looked down at the blade in his hands, and it pulsed once like a slow heartbeat, and his fingers tightened without meaning to, and he said, "I do not know why it let me hold it, but I will not shame its trust or yours." And Viren said, "Then come with me. There is something you must see before the night returns, and the machines Come again. They moved together through the broken path at the edge of the ruins, where strange black roots had pushed up from the ground, and old lights flickered weakly from towers that no longer stood strong, and Jace saw broken statues of alien warriors, some with wings, some with horns, some with eyes wide and proud, and he asked, "What is this place?" Environ said, "This was once the heart of our people, a training ground and a hall of memory, where every fighter came to test themselves and learn the song of the blade." She pushed open a half-buried door, and inside was cold and dark, and the air smelled like dust and oil and old blood, and they walked slowly down stone steps until they reached a wide round room, where a ring of pillars stood, and in the center was a raised stone with strange writing carved into it, and Jace asked, "What does it say?" And she said, "It says this blade belongs only to the one who would bleed for those not their own." Byron stepped back and told him to lay the blade on the stone, and Jace obeyed and placed it down gently, and then the room began to change and lights rose from the floor, and voices echoed all around, not loud, not soft, just full of power and sadness, and then the stone glowed, and a tall figure formed in light and shadow, the image of a warrior with eyes like Viren and armor, like the one who died, and she whispered, "Father." The figure spoke in an old voice that came not from lips but from memory, and it said, "I fell so my people could rise, but now I am gone, and the blade is alone, and it must choose once more." And the image turned to Jace and said, "Do you know pain? Do you know loss? Do you know what it means to fight for someone who would fear you or hate you or need you?" Jace wanted to speak, but the light wrapped around him, and he saw flashes of other lives, other battles, other deaths, and one moment hit harder than the rest, a young girl crying alone beside a burning village, and an alien hand reaching for her, just before the machine fire came again, and the blade glowed in her arms, and he knew without doubt that was Viren as a child. The image faded, and the blade trembled, and Viren looked at him, and said, "You saw what it wanted to show you, and now you know why I carry pain in my eyes, and silence in my heart, and why I do not trust easy, and why I gave you the sword, and not my people, and not the elders, and not even my blood." They left the chamber as night fell outside, and the sky filled with silver stars that blinked like eyes watching from a cold heaven. And Jace looked up and whispered, "I will not fail this trust." And the blade whispered back, not with words, but with warmth and weight, and promise of Irene pointed to the eastern ridge, where a thin red glow rose like fire under the earth, and she said, "They are coming again, the same machines that took my father and hunted your kind, and they will not stop until all fire is gone, and all voices fall, and I cannot lift the sword again, not now, not with this wound, and this broken arm, and this tired soul." Jace looked at the blade, then at her, then at the path, and then at the sky, and he said, "I do not know how to fight like your father, but I will stand where he stood, and hold what he held, and if they come, I will not run." She stepped closer and said, "I do not need another dead warrior. I need one who lives, one who stands, one who protects, not just me, but all who remain." And the sword glowed again like it heard her, and agreed. They sat by the edge of the village, waiting, watching, breathing, and the sword rested beside Jace, like a sleeping beast ready to wake. And when the sound of metal feet echoed across the hills, both of them rose not with fear, but with fire in their hearts, and one thought burning between them. The blade has chosen, and the night must now answer. The sky was no longer black but red like an open wound, as fire moved across the hills, and machines marched forward in rows without breath, without fear, without soul, and the earth shook under their metal steps. And Jace stood with the sword in his hands, and Viren beside him, holding her broken arm tight, but her eyes full of storm and pride. The first light of morning could not break through the smoke and the ash, and all sound was drowned by the clicking and grinding of metal and the distant screech of things that were never alive but still wanted to kill and feed. And Jace did not move, even as his legs trembled and his breath came short and dry. Viren spoke in a soft, low voice, and said, "These are not creatures of flesh. They are things built long ago by minds who wanted power and control. They turned against their makers, and now they move across stars to wipe all life. And the sword you carry is the only thing that makes them pause." Jace looked down at the blade, and it glowed brighter than ever before, and strange lines of light ran along the metal-like veins, and the whisper of the sword grew louder in his mind, not in words but in feelings: courage, duty, pain, love, hope, fire. The machines came closer, their forms clearer now, tall and spiked, with arms that ended in blades and wires and sparks, and heads that turned without sound, and many eyes glowing blue and white and red. And Jace could see they were not random. They were scanning, they were hunting, they were thinking. Viren pointed to the tallest one and said, "That is a command unit. It controls the others. If it falls, they scatter for a time, and we can run or strike again or regroup." And Jace said, "Then I will go for it." And she said, "No, you will die if you go alone." And he said, "Then I will die but I will not run, and the sword pulsed in his grip, as if to say, I agree. He stepped forward, not fast, not slow, just steady like the warrior he never trained to be, and the ground under his boots felt heavy. Like it knew a story was about to be written in blood and fire, and the machines reacted, eyes flaring, weapons shifting, energy rising as they saw the sword in his hand. The first machine struck a fast silver blur, with claws sharp as knives, but Jace moved faster than he thought possible, the sword guiding his hand, cutting through metal like cloth, and the pieces of the machine fell still, and, smoking before they hit the ground. More came, and Jace turned, and swung, and blocked, and dodged, and the blade became a part of him. Not just a weapon, but an extension of thought, and will, and heart. And Viren watched from behind a broken wall, her lips parted, her chest tight with fear, and all she whispered, he moves like my father did. No, not like him, something else, something new, something human, and the blade is louder now. I feel it in my bones, in my blood, it sings for him. Jace fought through 357 machines, sparks flying, metal screaming, his arms burning and lungs aching, but he did not stop, and each step brought him closer to the command unit, which now raised its massive arm and pointed at him, and spoke in a voice that echoed in every metal body. Target, threat level high, eliminates now. Dozens of machines turned toward Jace, but he ran, not away, but toward them, sword high, voice loud and raw as he shouted. Not in fear, but in rage, in memory, in defiance, and the blade in his hand blazed like a star. The machines rushed in, and Jace spun, and leaped, and struck, and fell, and rose again, and the ground was painted with broken metal, and scorched earth, and still he moved forward step by step, toward the heart of the enemy, reached the command unit, and it raised a heavy blade the size of a tree, and brought it down, but Jace rolled under, and struck at the knee joint, and wire snapped, and the giant fell to one side. But not broken, and Jace jumped onto its back, and drove the sword into a glowing core. The machine screamed a sound not of pain but of defeat, and power poured from the blade like lightning, and Jace cried out as it surged through him, and the command unit exploded in a flash of light and heat that shook the land and threw Jace into the dirt. Silence followed, only broken by the wind and the slow fall of ash, and Viren ran to him, calling his name, and dropped beside him as he opened his eyes, weak and shaking, but alive and still holding the blade, which now pulsed like a heartbeat, calm and steady. And sure, she touched his face and said, you are not my father, but you are something else, something they never saw coming, and maybe, just maybe, you are what this world needs. Jace smiled through blood and dust and said, I am just a man, but the sword, it chose me, and now I cannot walk away, not from this, not from you. And Viren nodded and helped him stand, and together they looked toward the burning horizon, where more battles waited, where more fire would fall, and where the blade would sing again. Jace lay under the broken sky, where smoke still drifted like ghost fingers across the air, and the sword rested beside him, warm and silent, and glowing, soft as if it too was tired from the battle. And Viren sat near him with her arm wrapped tight in old cloth, her eyes on the horizon, and her thoughts far behind it. The machines had stopped their march for now, their pots scattered and quiet, and their signals gone, but Viren warned him this was only one wave, not the end, and the storm still waited in the shadows of the stars, and Jace did not speak. He only listened to the silence and the way the sword pulsed, slow and steady, like it was still alive, like it remembered when he closed his eyes. The world changed, and he found himself not on the field, but in a place full of fire and steel, and strange towers that hummed with power, and he saw things that were not his to see. Warriors in armor, like Viren's father, swords drawn, voices shouting not in fear but in command and unity. He saw the blade in the hands of many, and then one, and that one was Viren's father, standing tall with eyes cold as ice, but full of love, as he turned to face a tide of machines far greater than Jace had ever known. And then the image broke and shifted, and he saw another face, a younger one, sharp and proud, with eyes full of Jace woke with a jolt, and the sword beside him flashed once, and then dimmed again, and he looked at Vir and said, I saw him, your father. And she said, the blade shows what it remembers. It wants you to know not just how to fight, but why. He told her of the vision of the young alien who stood near her father, but did not draw his blade, and watched the machines come and did nothing. And Viren's face changed, her voice colder, as she said, I know who that was. That was Kareth, my father's blood brother, and once his closest friend, now a name we do not speak among the living. Jace asked why, and Vir said, because he chose fear over courage, silence over truth. And when my father fell, Kareth said nothing, did nothing, and vanished before the fire died, and when we searched he was gone, and no grave ever held his bones. They decided to move before the sun rose too high, and the heat returned with it, and they walked through the ruins of a nearby city, where buildings leaned like tired giants, and the wind whispered through broken glass and twisted steel, and strange signs hung from wires that sparked, and Buzages asked what this place had been, and Viran said it was once a seat of learning and command, where the sword was made, where warriors trained, where records were kept, and if any truth remains, it is buried in these walls, or in the machines that still guard them. They entered a wide hall, lined with faded banners and broken lights, and at the far end was a door sealed tight with old energy, and Jace touched it with the blade, and the metal parted like cloth, and behind it was a room full of strange light and long dark panels with glowing lines that moved like rivers. Firing stepped in, and her fingers danced across the surface of one panel, and a voice filled the room, smooth and hollow and ancient. And it said, "Record, match found, welcome Viren, daughter of Theric, access granted." And the walls came to life with images and sound. They saw her father speaking to other leaders, warning them that the machines would not stop, that peace was a lie, and that one of them was hiding the truth, and the others laughed and turned away, and only one face remained cold and silent in the shadows, and that face was Kareth. Viren turned away, her face tight and her fists clenched, and she said, "He was not just a coward, he was the one who opened the gates. He was the reason my father died, and why the sword waited so long for another hand to lift it." Again just stepped close, and said, "Then we must find him. If he still lives." And Viren nodded, and said, "If he still lives, then he will answer for what he did, not just to my father but to all who died under false hope and blind trust." And the sword flashed once more, bright and clear like it too remembered the betrayal outside. The wind picked up, and the sky darkened again, and the machines would soon return, and time was not their ally. But now they had something more than fire or steel. They had purpose, and the blade would lead them not just to battle but to the truth, and the one who still hid in its shadow. Jace looked at the sword, then at Viran, then at the road ahead, and said, "Then let us find the ghost and finish what your father began." And the sword pulsed in answer, ready to walk through memory and metal once more. The road to the old capital was long and broken, with black trees reaching like claws and towers fallen across wide cracked fields and strange shapes, watching from the mist. And Jace walked with the sword on his back, and Viren by his side, her step slow but strong, and her eyes always ahead, never behind. They crossed the bridge of glass once used by nobles and warriors, where now only dust and silence remained, and below the river was dry and full of bones, not all of them from their kind. And Jace asked why the council had not come to help her people, and Viren said, "Because they lost their courage before the machines ever came ahead." Stood the gate of the capital, still tall and shining with old light, and guarded by two large machines. Not enemy machines, but ancient protectors built by her kind long ago, who scanned Jace with glowing blue eyes, but made no move. And Viren stepped forward, and said, "I return not for praise, not for forgiveness, but for truth." And the machines stepped aside in silence inside the capital. The streets were clean and cold, and empty of laughter or life, and the buildings rose smooth and white, untouched by war, and guarded by peace that cost too much. And Jace could feel the stares from behind hidden windows, and he knew they were not welcome, even if no one spoke it aloud. They reached the great hall, where tall figures in long robes sat around a circle of silver light, and the leader among them stood with pale skin and golden eyes, and said, "We see the daughter of Theric, and a human with a blade, and that is a sight we never thought to witness." Agan Viren bowed, not out of respect, but out of ritual, and said, "I bring no lies, only the sword that once led our people, and the one it chose." And the council murmured and watched Jace with narrow eyes, and the leader said, "The blade chooses in strange ways, but even that cannot erase what your father tried to do." Just stepped forward and said, "He tried to warn you, and you turned away, and now you hide behind high walls, while others burn and bleed and die." And the sword on his back glowed, and many eyes widened as the light touched the circle. The leader raised a hand and said, "We made peace with the machines years ago, and they honored it until your people came and woke the war again, and now you bring fire where we had silence, and the past where we had peace." And Jace said, "Then your peace was built on bones." And Lizrian took a step forward, her voice sharp like the edge of the blade, and said, "My father died for your peace, and you never once raised a hand to help, and I know now that one of you betrayed him and gave the machines what they needed to strike, and now we come for answers, not approval." The leader's face stayed calm, but the room grew tense, and one figure near the back shifted in his seat, and Jace saw the same face from the memory in the blade. The same eyes, the same pride, and he knew without doubt that this was Kareth, the blood brother who turned away. Kareth stood, and his voice was smooth and quiet, and full of old charm, and he said, "You come here with weapons and anger, and you want to break what little peace we have left." And Jace said, "We come with truth, and the sword knows you, and your silence." Viren asked him why he turned away, and why he did nothing when the gates fell, and her father bled. and her people cried out, and Kareth said, because your father was wrong. And I saw no victory, only more death, and the machines offered order. And balance and I chose to survive. The room fell into stillness, and the leaders looked at one another not with shock but with quiet shame. As if they had known, and said nothing, and the sword began to hum, not loud but deep, and full of sorrow, and rage and purpose, and Kareth stepped back as if it might leap from Jace's back and strike on its own. Byron said, "You may not have fired the first shot, but you opened the door. And now the blood is on your hands." And the council said nothing, for none of them dared to stand against the blade, or the truth it carried. And Kareth turned and walked away, not in shame but in fear. Jace looked at the others and said, "We do not need your help, but we will take your knowledge and your maps, and we will end what you began." And Byron said, "When this is over, you will answer not to me, but to all the voices you tried to silence." They left the great hall, and behind them the silence grew louder than any battle, and the sword pulsed as they stepped into the open light, ready to face the storm that would come. And the one who now hid among the machines, and whispered of power and control, while truth burned outside the walls. The storm did not wait for the sun to fall. It came early, with skies turning green and gray, and winds screaming across the ruins like voices of the dead, and machines moved again, not in small waves, but in a great wall of steel and fire, and all things that once lived seemed to hide from the sound of their march. Jace and Byron stood on a high ridge above the valley, where the old forge city had once burned. Now cold, now empty, now waiting, and behind them were the few who followed, not warriors, not soldiers, just broken people who had seen the sword and felt something stir inside, something that whispered fight or die with meaning. The sword rested in Jace's grip, and its glow was brighter now, but not wild. It was calm and steady, like it knew what had to be done, and accepted it. And Jace felt no fear, not because he thought he would win, but because he knew what he was fighting for, and that made all the weight easier to carry. Virene spoke as the first machines appeared below, tall and wide, and shaped like beasts, with red lights in their heads, and claws like hooks. And she said, "The council has not sent help, and they will not. They made their peace with lies, and we make ours with fire." And the Jace looked at the people behind them, some old, some young, some shaking, and he said, "I will go down first. I will draw their eyes, and you take them around the far side, and strike when the core is exposed." And she said, "You will not survive." And he said, "Then let the sword burn with mesh." Reached out her good hand and touched his shoulder and said, "You were a stranger once, and now you are the last shield between them and the dark. And if you fall, I will carry what remains, even if it kills me." Achi walked down the slope alone, his boots sinking into ash and dust, and his heart calm as the wind wrapped around him, and the sword pulsed once, then again, like a drumbeat, slow and proud, and the machines turned to face him. All at once, as if they had been waiting for this moment, one stepped forward, larger than the rest, with black armor and long blade, arms and many eyes, and it spoke in a voice made of broken code and echo, and it said, "You carry a tool of war built by fear and rage, and I offer you peace. Step away and survive." And Jace said, "I carry a gift not for me, but for those you would erase. And I offer you nothing," the sword answered before the machine could speak again. It rose in Jace's hands, and flashed like lightning, and the ground cracked under him, as he moved faster than thought, faster than reason, faster than he ever had, and struck the first machine clean through the chest. The others swarmed forward, and Jace became a storm of silver light and raw will, his arms burning, his breath heavy, but his focus sharp and clean. And behind him the others moved through the ruins, just as planned, with Virene leading them through hidden paths, once used by her father long ago. The fight became chaos and fire, and the machines began to surround Jace, pushing him back inch by inch, and he cried out, not in pain but in fury, and the sword seemed to sing with him, not with voice but with light that shook the ground and cracked the sky. Then the biggest machine appeared from the smoke, towering over all the others, with armor like stone and a core glowing bright red, and Virene saw it from the wall above, and shouted, "That is their heart. If it falls, the others will break." And she turned to the people and said, "Now is the time." And they rushed forward with fire and blades, and broken courage turned whole. Again Jace reached the edge of his strength and fell to one knee, but before the machine could strike, the others hit from the side, and Virene leaped with her weak arm bound, and her blade in the other, and drove it deep into the crack of the giant's back, and the sword in Jace's hand screamed in light, as if calling to her, and she shouted his name, and he rose once more. They fought side by side, not perfect, not smooth, just true, and the giant machine began to shake, and sparks flew, and its limbs jerked, and its voice failed, and Jace drove the sword into the red core, with all that was left in him, and the fire that came after was not heat. It was memory, it was pain, it was freedom. The machines fell one by one, and the silence that came after felt heavy, and real like the end of something that had no name, and Jace dropped to the ground, and the sword clattered beside him, still glowing, still breathing, still waiting. Virene knelt beside him, her face stained with ash, and tears and blood, and she whispered, "The storm is gone, but you are still here," and he smiled weakly, and said, "Not all of me, maybe, but enough," and the sword pulsed once more as if to say, "Yes, you did not fall, you rose." The wind was quiet now, not still but soft and tired, as if the land itself had taken a breath and did not know what to do next, and the sky above was pale with light and smoke mixed together, and the valley below was full of fallen machines still, and broken, their lights gone, their sounds silent, and the war seemed far away now, even though the scars still burned. Jace lay in the dust, eyes half open, breath slow, chest rising with effort, and the sword rested beside him. Still warm, still glowing, but not like before, not bright, not sharp, more like a fading flame, holding on just a little longer. And Virene sat near him, her hand on his arm, her face calm, but wet with tears that would not stop. She said, "You stopped them. Jace, you stood alone at the front, and now even the machines are quiet, and the sky is ours again." And Jace smiled just a little, and said, "I did not stop them. The sword did, and you did, and the others who chose to fight and stand and not run even when fear was all they had." The people came from behind the old stone walls and ruins, eyes wide, steps, unsure voices, low as they looked at Jace, and at the sword, and at Virene, and someone whispered, "He is the one the blade chose. He is the fire that woke the old spirit again." And others nodded, and came closer, not to touch, just as Virene stood slowly, her legs shaking, her breath short but steady, and she lifted the sword in both hands, and held it high, and said, "This blade once belonged to my father." Then it waited in silence, then it chose a stranger, a human, a fighter with no armor and no crown, and now it has burned through the last storm. But the sword did not speak now, it only pulsed once, and then once more, and then it grew still and cold, not dead, not broken, but resting as if its story was finished. And Jace looked at it, and then at Virene, and said, "I think it gave all it had." And she nodded and said, "Maybe that is what it was meant for, not to be kept, not to be passed down forever, but to be used when all else failed." The council came, 3 of them, with guards behind, but not with weapons, not with threats, and their faces were not proud. Now their robes not clean now, and the one who once called Jace a danger now looked at him with low eyes, and said, "We were wrong, we were afraid, we chose walls and words, and he chose to bleed." Virene stepped forward, her voice clear, not loud but full, and she said, "My father died trying to warn you, and you turned your backs, and now others died to fix what you let rot. And if you want peace, now it will not come with silence, it will come with memory, and justice, and fire when needed, and Jace will not carry that alone." The council bowed their heads, and one said, "The sword was never meant for your kind, and yet it chose, and we will not question it again." And Virene said, "Good, then remember this day not with songs but with change." And the people cheered not with loud cries, but with strong ones like wind pushing back the dark day. Passed, and the land began to heal, slow and small, with green breaking through ash, and lights shining from towers once dark. And Jace walked with Virene through the broken capital, where new voices spoke, and old ghosts began to fade, and children laughed in streets where machines once marked Jews no longer carried the sword, not every day, not in battle for it, no longer burned like before, but he placed it in the Hall of the Fallen, where the name of her father now stood beside his, and the blade rested there, not as a weapon now, but as a sign of what was done, and what would never be forgot. Virene watched him with quiet eyes and said, "You were never meant to come here, and yet you did, and you were never meant to fight, and yet you bled, and you were never meant to be the one, and yet the sword knew before we did, and now you are part of our story." And Jace said, "Your world is not mine, but maybe it is now, maybe just a little." They stood in the hall, with firelight dancing across the blade, and no voices rose, and no sound broke the stillness, and yet something in the air felt full, like a page written with all that needed to be said. And when Jace placed his hand on the sword one last time, it pulsed faintly, not bright, not loud, just enough to say, "Well done," enough to say goodbye, enough to say the fire lives even when the blade rests. And Virene took his hand and held it, and together they stepped outside into the new light, where the war had ended, and the future waited with open skies and soft wind, and the sound of a world beginning again.